Welcome back to MLL 400, the literature of travel in the 20th century. Where we left off last week, we had of course followed Hermann Hesse on his travels to Southeast Asia and to the German colonies. And we had contextualized that by talking a little bit about the European colonial projects and imperialism. We talked about the British and the Dutch East India companies. We had talked about how the West began to define these Asian peoples and territories as their cultural other. We had talked about how Hesse sort of sets out in search of this imagined East, this mythical East, and how he had exoticized it and orientalized it. And we had, of course, also sort of talked again about Moriogai and questioned how his narrative probably had been an attempt to counter that Orientalization of the East, of places like Japan. So we've talked several times now, or we've used this term of Orientalizing and the Orient and Orientalism. And I thought it would be a good idea to just spend a little bit more time on this really important term, which really has two meanings. Sort of there is a meaning that is associated with that original meaning of the Orient, meaning the East as it is defined by Europeans. It's a word with a Latin root, and when we use the word Orientalism in that sense, it really just means the style and the artifacts and traits considered characteristic of the peoples and cultures of Asia. Now, it has taken on, especially in academia in the last few decades, another meaning. And that is really the representation of Asia, especially the Middle East, in a stereotyped way that is regarded as embodying a colonialist or imperialist attitude. And that second meaning is really the result of a very, very important book called Orientalism that was published in 1978 by a great scholar of English literature at Columbia University called Edward Said, who himself was from the Middle East. He was from Palestine. I have a clipping here from that book, from the introduction, and it reads, "What I will argue is that the French and the British have had a long tradition, what I shall be calling Orientalism, a way of coming to terms with the Orient that is based on the Orient's special place in European Western experience." Taking the late 18th century as a very roughly defined starting point, Orientalism can be discussed and analyzed as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, dealing with it by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it, by teaching it, settling it, ruling over it. In short, Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having authority over the Orient. So you see that the term Orientalism and Orientalizing really has taken on another meaning, one that is really heavily laden with politics and power politics, i.e., the way the West sees the East and thereby defines it and dominates it. So this discourse then of Orientalism really is a discourse distinction between West and East, which becomes the other. And this discourse, as Said claims, essentially seeks the representation of, exercise of control over, and submission of the Orient. And this wonderful book, which you should all put on your reading list, is produced by lots and lots of different actors who are not necessarily working on sort of a master plan that aims at orientalizing or defining the other, but that are all engaged in different disciplines. And he says there is academia, that is universities, making maps, writing history, writing the ethnography of places. There are museums that collect and display. There are the belles-lettres literatures and the arts. And then, of course, there are actual concrete colonial institutions or corporations like the East India companies. And this discourse then ultimately results in the domination and authority over what he calls the Orient, both politically and economically, and of course discursively. Now, why is this important? It's important because Said then goes on and talks about a lot of different examples of this. He looks at literature primarily, but we can also see this in paintings. We've, of course, talked about literature already a little bit. We talked about Madame Chrysanthème, how Madame Chrysanthème essentially exoticizes and orientalizes the East. And there is especially the uniform association between Orient and sex. Women as creatures of male power fantasies, as in Madame Butterfly, or as in some of these visual images. It's perceived of as the cradle of Western civilization, yet it has been utterly neglected. So we often see paintings or read in literature about these cradles of Western civilization that have fallen into disrepair, and Western powers go there to record them or to be guardians of this civilization. And they study it through archaeology. Archaeology very much is a modern discipline that came into being in the 19th century, and it was practiced by these colonial powers. Oriental studies. These departments open at universities at Oxford and Cambridge and Paris and Leipzig, where the Orient is studied. These departments are no longer called Oriental Studies departments. They are now usually called Asian Studies or East Asian Studies Department. And that is really a result of this book by Edward Said. These name changes came into being only in the last couple of decades. He talks about the administrative and the commercial aspects. Things like the Suez Canal being built by French and British corporations. Rubber plantations. This, of course, is something that even comes up in Hesse. I have that clipping here, right? You might remember from last week. The Chinese talks to the English functionary about rubber prices. And repeatedly I heard the English word rubber. It is the ruling word in the East. And then, of course, there are these Western fantasies of a purer, more innocent East, right? And again, I have that clipping here from Hermann Hesse, the European who travels to the Malayan Islands for other than business reasons, even if he has no hope of ever attaining it, constantly has as the background of his imagination and desires the landscapes and the primitive paradisiacal innocence of a Van Santen island. Hesse, of course, echoes many of the traits Said sees as definitive of the discourse of Orientalism. Now, what we will discuss today is, what about other rising colonial powers, especially those in Asia, especially Japan? Does this discourse of Orientalism equally apply to a country like Japan that in theory belongs to the territory that Europeans would have referred to as the Orient? Now, Japan in the 1880s starts to build its own colonial empire, especially in continental Asia, Korea and Manchuria. Now, Japan achieves the revision of the unequal treaties we had talked about a couple of weeks ago in 1894, but already in the 1870s had begun to force similar treaties on Korea, which Japan saw as vital to its national interests, but which at the time was still nominally a tributary state to China. So these tensions over Korea then eventually erupt in a war between Japan and China in 1894, which is the first Sino-Japanese War, which Japan, to everybody's surprise, emerges from as the victor. And as a result, it receives the island of Taiwan, and it gains control over the Korean peninsula, and it also receives parts of Manchuria. But for the time being, other Western powers intervene, especially Russia, which had its own interests in Manchuria. Here you have some Japanese woodblock prints that depict that war, which was both fought as a naval war and as a land war. And especially the image on the right, I think it's very interesting how Japan depicts itself as a modern nation. You see the soldiers all wearing Western uniforms, united under their national flag, the flag of Japan, and how the Chinese are depicted as sort of an unorganized lot wearing these traditional uniforms. They have these banner flags, and of course stand on the lower plane of the paintings. The Japanese dominate this painting. Now what's really interesting is, and we will return to that in the second course stream, is that Yosano Akiko's youngest brother actually died during the Sino-Japanese War. Following the Sino-Japanese War then is another war between Japan and Russia, and that war was really over the control of what we usually call Manchuria, that is the northeastern provinces of China where the Manchu originate, who were actually the rulers of the Qing dynasty. And the Russian Empire in the 19th century had sort of started to claim parts of Manchuria, and in the result of this war, from which again Japan sort of emerged victoriously, even though they had to pay a very, very high price in terms of loss and life, but also financially. The war almost ruined Japan. And here you have again a couple of interesting posters. You have a Russian propaganda poster depicting the imagined military superiority over Japan, and then you have a Japanese poster which sort of celebrated this victory. But really, again, to everybody's surprise, Japan was able to beat back a Western power in this war and showed that it was militarily at least an equal to Western powers. And as a result, Japan gains control really over the Korean peninsula and acquires the Russian leases in Manchuria. Those territories were not technically colonies, they were leases, and on those leased territories the Russians had started to build railways, and the Japanese gain control of these railway lines, which develop into a huge conglomerate. It's called the South Manchurian Railway Company, which, and we will talk a little more about that later, was actually very similar to the East India companies of the European powers. Now what is really interesting is that simultaneously the relationship that Japan had with China was really changing. Now until the Meiji Restoration, Japan's views of China had been shaped what is usually referred to as kangaku, or the study of Han civilization. And China, of course, had over centuries profoundly impacted Japanese culture, and we had seen how, for example, people like Moriogai were still studying Chinese poetry, Confucian text, right? China was still seen as a cultural center. However, as Japan's military and economy eclipses that of China and Japan becomes this modern nation, Japan actually becomes the preferred destination of Chinese students and reformers like Huang Zunxian. And we observe a discursive change in the way China is depicted and imagined via media, scholarship, and art. And again, here you have a very interesting visual depiction, a Japanese woodblock print of the surrender of the Chinese to the Japanese after the Sino-Japanese War. Behind those Chinese you have Western advisors to the Qing Empire, and they of course also bow to the Japanese. At the same time, and this is of course again why this is so important to our class today, continental Asia, Korea, Manchuria, Mongolia, territories that become increasingly controlled by Japan turn into popular travel destinations for Japanese. And here you have some posters that are testimony to that development. And I think those posters probably will remind you of some of those Art Deco posters from Europe from the 1920s that we saw last week. So here we have one for a Japanese shipping line, we have one for the South Manchuria Railway Company, and then we have another poster from the South Manchuria Railway Company of an exoticized, orientalized Manchurian woman. Now, and all of this essentially amounts to the making of Japan's own Orient very similar to the way Europeans forged that view of the Orient as the other. Now I put this into quotation marks because technically, of course, Korea, China are to the west of Japan. Nevertheless, during the Meiji period, the Japanese start to refer to these places literally as the Orient. They call it Toyo, literally meaning the Eastern Seas, and they call the study of this territory Toyo Gaku, the studies of the Eastern Seas. And this comes to replace what used to be called Kangaku, studies of Han civilizations. They form new academic departments like the Toyo Bunka Kenkyojo, the Research Institute of Oriental Studies at Tokyo University. That's a photo here on the right with two Chinese lions that they've probably brought back from China. And just like in Europe, many interconnected sectors of Japanese society are really complicit in studying, knowing, and controlling parts of Toyo, that is continental Asia, which is now defined as Japan's other. And interestingly, Japan is no longer part of that. So Japan is not part of Toyo, the Orient. The Japanese themselves exclude themselves from that. Now, over time, China's cultural centrality is further eroded by being referred to as Shina, which is a pure phonetic rendering of China, instead of calling it Chugoku, or the Middle Kingdom, as it used to be referred to. And similar to what's happening in Europe, museums, archives, archaeological researchers see themselves as guardians and protectors of the cultural and historical legacy of Asia. And similar to the West, the colonization of Toyo is largely driven by alliances of political forces that have an interest in this. In Japan, it's the ultra-nationalist forces and industrialists, people who make money from this. And in the case of Japan, it's an alliance between the South Manchuria Railway Company and the Kanto Army, about which I will talk a little bit more later. Now, the South Manchuria Railway Company was founded in 1906 to oversee the Manchurian railways in the wake of the Russo-Japanese War. It became Japan's largest corporation. And as I said, it was very much modeled on the European East Asia companies, especially in the way that it was publicly listed on the Tokyo Stock Exchange so people could buy stocks in it, but of course it also enjoyed government support. So the company was not exclusively engaged in railways, it was engaged in building and supervising harbors, railroads, hotels, mines. It was involved in local government. It had a massive research wing that studied agriculture, colonial policy across the entire empire. And it was closely aligned with the Kanto Army. That was a branch of Japan's Imperial Army and that had been formed especially to protect those lease holdings in Manchuria, and that became incredibly powerful and that increasingly did its own thing, namely the imperialist expansion into continental Asia. Now, the South Manchuria Railway Company was also in charge of 250,000 Japanese settlers who came to Manchuria to farm, to work in schools, to work just in this huge administrative apparatus. And the company sort of propagated its own project by way of visual art. You have a poster here on the bottom right. And by inviting writers and artists to visit the territories they controlled and to write about it. And this is, of course, where this week's writer, Yosano Akiko, comes into the picture. Now, Yosano Akiko was married to Yosano Tekkan, and the two of them are among the most celebrated Japanese modern poets. Yosano Tekkan emerges as one of the reformers of the Japanese tanka, a short traditional verse. He starts a literary journal, he embraces romanticism, and Yosano Akiko falls under his spell. She marries him. She herself becomes an acclaimed poet. Her first collection, called Tangled Hair Midaregami from 1901, really puts her on the map, and her fame would actually eventually eclipse even that of her husband. Interestingly, both also have actually a strong impact on modern Chinese poetry by way of translations that were done by Zhou Zuoren, an important Chinese intellectual of the 1920s, who also admired Yosano Akiko's advocacy on behalf of women's rights. She was very active in that respect. They both traveled to Europe in 1911, and then in the spring of 1928 they are invited by the South Manchuria Railway Company to travel to North China and to write about their experience. And it's their experiences that we will discuss in the second course stream of this week. So I will see you again shortly.